So welcome to our 7th digital edition launches, and the last one that features student editions. We'll have next week another launch, which is a kind of a keynote launch by Edmund Wareham. And it's quite appropriate to have 2 manuscripts today that launch us into the early modern period, but with a manuscript focus. And we'll first hear from Carrie Heusinkveld about a French edition of the Metamorphoses in a Douce manuscript from the Bodleian. And then we'll navigate further south and hear about the Libro de Cosmographia of Pedro de Medina by Javaria, Abbasi. And I'll start off with handing over to Carrie to introduce her edition to us. Over to you, Carrie.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for coming. So I'll be discussing MS Douce 117, which is a 16th century French verse translation of Book 1 of Ovid's Metamorphoses by the poet Clément Marot. And Marot isn't a household name today, and he's been somewhat overshadowed by the generation of Pleiad poets that succeeded him. But during his lifetime, he was a leading literary figure in the court of Francis I and played an instrumental role in the birth of French Renaissance literature. And his first printed work, L'Adolescence Clémentine, has been credited with revolutionizing French poetry, and his edition of François Villon's Roman de la Rose has been described as the first edition of a major work in the modern sense of the word. And in addition to being a writer in his own right, he was also a very prolific translator and translated the Psalms, the works of Petrarch and Virgil, and the first 3 books of Ovid's Metamorphoses, among others, into French. So MS Douce 117, which was bequeathed to the Bodleian by Francis Douce in 1834, is the only known extant manuscript version of Marot's translation of the first book of the Metamorphoses. So it's quite an interesting manuscript just in terms of its uniqueness, but it was also quite compelling to me because when I first started investigating its history and background, I realized that really simple facts concerning its original ownership and its date of creation are actually surprisingly difficult to pin down, even though the Bodleian catalogues give the impression that these things are very clear-cut. So in the Bodleian's online catalogue, 117 is dated from after 1531, and the summary catalogue entry states that it was no doubt the presentation copy to the king, which at first seemed to be very logical deductions. So the parchment is really thick and it's of a very high quality, and as you can see from the picture on the side, it has these very beautiful, very lavish illuminations. And it also opens with a dedicatory epistle to Francis I, all of which seem to support the hypothesis that it was a gift from Marot to the king. And finally, the first printed version of Marot's translation wasn't published until 1534, so the hypothesis that the manuscript was created after 1531 seems quite reasonable. However, another scholar has suggested that MS Douce 117 was actually created at some point between 1526 and 1528, based on textual clues from the opening epistle and the supposed identity of its illuminator. So in the dedication, Marot alludes to an occasion on which he gave a preliminary reading of the translation to the king during a sojourn at Amboise, and historical records indicate that Marot and Francis were at Amboise at the same time in 1526, when Marot was still a member of the court of Marguerite de Navarre, who is the king's sister. So some scholars have speculated that this is the occasion that he refers to in the dedication. And furthermore, the illuminations have been attributed to Guillaume II Leroy, who was an illuminator and engraver based in Lyon, which lends support to the theory that Marot first presented his work to the king in 1526, because Leroy is thought to have died in 1528. So if we could go on to the next slide. Thank you. So Leroy has been identified as the illuminator on the basis of very strong similarities between the first 2 illuminations in the manuscript and 2 of the woodcuts in a 1510 edition of the Metamorphoses, which was printed in Lyon and which Leroy is believed to have illustrated. So on the left is the first woodcut from Leroy's edition, And as you can see, it's a distinctly Christianized version of Ovid's creation story, since God is depicted in the foreground, surrounded by his newly created animals, including a lion and a deer, and there's also a group of trees on the right, and as you can see, a large mass that's supposed to depict chaos on the left, and the sun and moon are also shown overhead. And in the second woodcut, which is shown on the right, there's a depiction of the division of the Earth into 5 different zones. So now we'll compare the images to the ones in 117. So if we could go to folio 3V in the manuscript.
Do you want Andrew to show it?
Yes,
Yeah.
that would be great. Yes, so as you can see in the first illumination in the manuscript, the layout and details are very similar to the first woodcut in the Wa's book. So just like in the woodcut, you can see God in the foreground, and there's a lion and a group of trees on the right, and a rock that depicts chaos in the background on the left. And you can also see, you can't see it very well, but the moon and the sun are also shown overhead. And it's very much the same story with the second illumination. So if we could go on to folio 6R. Great. So the second illumination is basically exactly the same as the woodcut. And if you compare the writing labeling the zones in both of them, they're actually exactly the same. So based on the similarities between the illuminations and the woodcuts, it does seem quite reasonable to assume that Leroy, who's thought to have been both an illuminator as well as an engraver, was the artist behind both the woodcuts and the illuminations. But if we could go back to the presentation, please. Yes, so this theory is kind of complicated, though, when you examine the woodcuts and the illuminations alongside other depictions of the Metamorphoses that were circulating in Europe in the early 16th century. So the woodcuts in the 1510 edition that Leroy is thought to have engraved were actually modeled on illustrations into Italian editions of the Metamorphoses. So one was an Italian translation by Giovanni Bonsignore that was printed in Venice in 1497, and a Latin edition with a commentary by Raphael Regius, which was published in Parma in 1505. So many of the illustrations in the 1505 Parma edition, which were made by an unknown engraver, were in turn modeled on the woodcuts in the 1497 Italian edition, which also haven't been attributed to any artist. So here on the left is the woodcut depicting the creation of the world from the 1497 Italian translation, and the same image turns up in the 1505 Latin edition, which you can see on the right. And as we've already seen, this image also appears in the Wa's 1510 edition and in MS Douce 117. So if you look at the similarities and the differences between the two Italian editions and the Wa's edition, you can tell that Leroy drew inspiration from both for his own engravings. So his woodcut depicting the creation of the world may have been inspired by the illustration in either the Latin edition on the right or the Italian translation on the left, but the woodcut depicting the 5 zones in the Lyon edition that we just saw a moment ago was modeled on an illustration in the 1505 edition, which doesn't have a corresponding prototype in the Italian translation. So in that one, there's no illustration depicting the division of the world into zones. So consequently, the similarities between the illuminations in Douce 117 and the Wa's woodcuts indicate that the illuminator may have had access either to the Wa's engravings or to their prototypes in the Latin edition and the Italian translation, but they're not conclusive evidence that Locher himself was the illuminator. So another factor that sort of complicates the idea that Locher was the artist is that the woodcuts in the 1497 Italian translation actually served as inspiration to artists working in a variety of mediums. And this is because it was actually the first illustrated edition of the Metamorphoses printed in Europe. So it would have been the only model that was available to many artists. So there are several examples of works of art that show the influence of the woodcuts, including one of Titian's paintings. But just for the sake of time, I'm only going to show one, which is Michelangelo Anselmi's Apollo and Marsyas. And this was painted in about 1540. So the painting on the right and the woodcut in the 1497 edition on the left both depict the story of Marsyas' contest with Apollo as a continuous narrative, and they both include precisely the same episodes from the story. So on the left in the woodcut and on the right in the painting, Athena is shown playing the aulos and looking at her reflection in a pool of water, and then in both images in the center, Apollo is shown standing and Marsyas is sitting and holding the aulos. And then on the right in the woodcut and the left of the painting, you can see Apollo bracing himself against a stump and holding Marsyas' arm in one hand and a knife in the other as he prepares to flay him. And just as kind of an interesting aside, I'm sure you've noticed that the direction of the narrative in the painting is the reverse of the woodcut. And as Henrike observed at one point, this probably indicates that it was copied from a cheap pirated edition in which the woodcuts were mere images of the original versions. So I wasn't able to identify any examples of illuminations inspired in the 1497 edition, other than the ones found in MS Douce 117, but their impact beyond the realm of print does point to a wide circulation and sphere of influence that wasn't just limited to the graphic arts. So the similarities between the illuminations in 117 and the Locher's woodcuts can be regarded as a sign of the widespread influence of the illustrations, but not necessarily as definitive proof that Locher was the illuminator. So consequently, I would suggest that Locher's death in 1528 doesn't rule out the possibility that the manuscript was created at some point after 1528, and that Marot may have actually presented the beginning of his translation to Francis during a second sojourn at Amboise that's known to have occurred in 1530. So if we could go on to the next slide. Thank you. So this conclusion seems to agree with the Bodleian catalogue entry, which dates the manuscript from after 1531, but I wanted to see if we could date it even more precisely. And in order to do that, we have to turn to clues from Marot's biography and his other writings. So the first line of the epistle dedicated to the king in 117 begins with the phrase, "Long before your royal generosity made me the successor of my father's estate or position." So this suggests that the manuscript, though perhaps not the translation itself, was created after Marot had succeeded his father, Jean Marot, as a court poet in the royal household. And Jean Marot died either at the end of 1526 or early 1527, but his son, Clément, didn't officially succeed him until 1528. So that indicates that the manuscript was probably created during or after 1528. And furthermore, Marot states in an epistle written in 1530, which you can also see on the screen, that he gave an illuminated copy of the translation to the Duke of Lorraine when he was visiting Paris for the marriage of Francis I to Eleanor of Austria in the winter of 1530. And this indicates that at least one copy of the manuscript was made at some point between 1531. And we also know that this manuscript that Marot gave to the Duke was sold at the auction of the library of Lucien Gros in 1957. And although there's unfortunately no record of who bought it and we don't know where it currently is, the text is preserved in a transcription in the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, and it corresponds very, very closely with the text of 117. So both manuscript texts differ considerably from the printed version in 1534, which indicates that they were probably commissioned around the same time. So taken all together, these clues suggest that Marot probably commissioned Douce 117 and the manuscript presented to the Duke at some point between 1528, when he officially joined the court, and 1530, when the Duke was visiting Paris. So the fact that there was more than one manuscript of Marot's translation recalls the other claim that was made in the catalogue entry for Douce 117, which speculates that it was the presentation copy to Francis I. However, there aren't any marks of ownership in the manuscript that support this claim, and it was probably made on the basis of the opening epistle to the king. But if you compare the manuscript with the printed version, you can see that the dedication isn't actually unique to the manuscript. So I'd suggest that MS Douce 117 probably wasn't created for any one specific person. And this idea is indirectly supported by another poem that Marot wrote in 1544, in which he asked the king to fund the creation of several illuminated copies of his translation of Book 3 of the Metamorphoses, which he was planning to give to potential patrons. So this isn't proof, but it suggests that MS Douce may have been created under similar circumstances, and that Marot commissioned several copies of Book 1 with no particular recipient in mind, and just kept them on hand to give as gifts to various benefactors as the occasion arose. So just to pull all this together and sum up why reopening the investigation into the dating, creation, and ownership of the manuscript is significant. It complicates the hypothesis that Locher was the illuminator, but it also opens up previously unrecognized dimensions of the manuscript, shedding light on the movement of printed works across geographic and linguistic borders in the 16th century. And finally, but perhaps most significantly, it opens up a window into the dialogue between manuscript and print. So the fact that manuscripts heavily influenced printing techniques and technology has been well documented, but the impact of print on manuscript creation and illumination, particularly in French manuscript culture, has been little studied in comparison. So connections between print sources and German and Netherlandish manuscripts have been previously investigated, but Franco-Italian interactions in this crosstalk form a largely unexplored field of study. So Douce 117 is a unique point of entry into this exchange in the early Renaissance, and I'm hoping that the digital edition will increase its availability to scholars in manuscript studies and art history, as well as early modern French literature. So on that note, I'm just going to wrap up by saying a few words about the digital edition and where I'm hoping to take the project from here. So the manuscript is 54 folios, which was quite a lot to photograph, transcribe, and encode. So at this point, the edition just includes facsimiles and a diplomatic transcription, but I'm planning to also add a normalized transcription just to make it as accessible as possible, since, as I said, I'm hoping it will be of interest beyond the field of French Renaissance literature. And I also think that further study of 117 in collaboration with art historians would be a very fruitful area of investigation, because my findings do question the identification of Locher as the illuminator, but I unfortunately don't really have the necessary background or training to pronounce any sort of definitive judgment. So studying manuscript in cooperation with specialists in illumination and 16th century manuscripts would be a necessary next step, and would possibly be an interesting avenue of research for future history of the book students to explore. So just to conclude, I would like to thank Henrike and Andrew for all their help throughout the project, and also everyone here for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions after Javaria's presentation.
Many thanks, that's fascinating. I think since we have already seen a bit of the manuscript, we'll now pass on to Javaria directly, and then we can look at both manuscripts after Javaria's talk. So over to you, Javaria. Welcome to Screen Share.
Can everyone see the screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So good afternoon or morning to everyone, depending on where you are. My name is Javaria, and today we'll be traversing the Navigator's Universe, or the worlds of MS Canon Ital 243, Pedro de Medina's Libro de Cosmographía of 1538, with a special focus on my digital edition of the manuscript encoded in TI P5 XML. Now, I'd like to begin with an introduction or discussion of the manuscript itself. MS Canon Ital 243, which I refer to as the Libro, is comprised of 66 pages foliated in a brown hand. It is a cosmographical manual that begins with a dedication to Charles V, the King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor of the time, that is followed by a table of contents that outlines 82 sections, which comprise 82 questions. The text is constructed as a dialogue, wherein a university graduate, licenciado, and a ship pilot, piloto, ask questions of a cosmographer, Pedro de Medina. Questions serve as section headings and are rubricated in red, while the cosmographer's responses are structured in paragraph form and written in black. The manuscript also contains beautifully illustrated diagrams, some of which I'm going to ask Andrew Dunning to showcase later. Essentially, the Libro is a didactic text, a manual. It's something designed for teaching. And this is unsurprising considering Medina's history. Those members of the audience with an interest in the history of Iberian science may have heard of Pedro de Medina. He was the author of one of two widely circulated navigation manuals in 16th century Europe, the Arte de Navegar of 1545, which had over 20 different foreign editions, the last of which, printed in 1633, nearly 88 years after its first printing, attests the longevity of Medina's theoretical influence. While Medina was already renowned among his Spanish contemporaries for his Libro de Grandezas y Cosas Memorables de España, it was the Arte and its subsequent abbreviated form, Regimiento de Navegación, which earned him widespread acclaim as a cosmographer. Pedro de Medina was born into a household that belonged to the family of the Dukedom of Medina Sidonia. A fun fact for my British audience is that this is the same dukedom whose seventh duke was actually the captain of the Spanish Armada when he was defeated by the British, but I digress. In 1538, Medina availed himself of the dukedom's close ties with Charles V and submitted the Libro, which you can see on screen, in its present manuscript form, alongside two nautical tables not bound to it, to the Council of Indies for a royal license to work as a cosmographer. A royal decree dated December 20th, 1538, granted Medina the license. Medina then moved to Seville, where he found employment as an examiner and cosmographer for services rendered at the Casa de Contratación. After Medina submitted the manuscript to the Council of Indies and attained the title of cosmographer, little is known of the manuscript's circulation, except for the fact that it was never printed. In comparison to his printed cosmographical works, the Arte and the Regimiento, the Libro has generated little scholarly interest. Poring over the particular use of technical and theoretical language transcribed in an elegant black hand, my digital edition was motivated by a personal desire to understand how this manuscript, which jump-started Medina's career, has been so overlooked by historians of science. The last time Medina's manuscript was taken as a serious object of study was in 1972, when historian Ursula Lamb printed a black and white facsimile edition in English translation entitled A Navigator's Universe, which you can see I have here, to lukewarm and even negative critical reception. The assessment by critics, and indeed even stated by Lamb herself in the introduction, was that Medina's, quote, lack of description of new phenomena or hypotheses has overshadowed his contribution to teaching methods and concepts which created the possibilities of progress. The Journal of European Studies even went so far as to question, quote, whether a text of this sort is worth publishing in its facsimile when it omits any geography or discussion of the extent of the known world, subjects which were frequently included in other cosmographies of the period. Undergirding this assessment is the notion that Medina's work lacks the hallmarks of scientific modernity when it fails to reference the New World and how its discovery challenged classical models. Borrowing concept from Dr. Aisha Ramachandran, The maestro del Libro de Cosmographía was no world maker. Unlike other works in the mid to late 16th century, the Libro failed to imagine a world beyond the Aristotelian and Ptolemaic models that had endured throughout the Middle Ages. However, after reading the Libro, I wasn't so convinced of this assessment. My hypertextual edition is part of a broader project designed to showcase that Medina's universe was not as static as critics presumed. I hypothesized that while it cites the classical texts that were staples in the field of cosmography, it also modifies them based on practical knowledge acquired through the navigation and conquest of the New World. In this sense, I argue that unlike critics of Lamb's facsimile edition, MS Canon Ital 243 is more modern than it appears. To test this hypothesis, I asked 3 questions that you can see on screen to be answered through a digital edition. But why these questions? I selected the first 2 questions as the framework to test my hypothesis that Medina's texts were more modern than they appear after examining the state of normal science, to borrow from Thomas Kuhn's preeminent theory of scientific revolutions in early to mid-16th century Spain. In other words, I assessed Medina's manuscript in light of the paradigms or accepted examples of actual scientific practice in wider Iberian society where Medina was educated, and the Casa de Contratación in Seville, where he aimed to be employed as a cosmographer upon receipt of his manuscript. But what even is cosmography? As a branch of knowledge, cosmography comprised the study of the natural world and encompassed the modern disciplines of astronomy, meteorology, chronology, and geography. In the words of historian of science Maria Portuondo, in 16th century Spain, cosmography was a secret science, or imperial secret due to its inextricable ties to vulnerable Spanish territories in the New World. And so work published in the field was heavily censored and rarely disseminated in printed form. Manuscripts like Medina's are therefore important artifacts of 16th century scientific knowledge. Cosmographers were deeply informed by Renaissance humanism and drew from the classical works of Ptolemy, Aristotle, and medieval texts such as Sacro Bosco's De Sfera, but found them difficult to employ as a means of practically cataloging the New World. As noted by scholar of Iberian science José María López Pinheiro, while this did not lead to a direct confrontation with the authority of the classics, it did produce the recognition of facts outside of their authority. Over time, the accumulation of such facts led to a cognizance of the, quote, superioridad de lo moderno frente a lo antiguo, end quote, which manifested in the orientation of áreas técnicas a la idea de lo progreso. Applied science lay at the forefront of this new modern sensibility towards more empirical methods. Cosmography in the time of the Libro's creation became intertwined with 3 forms of applied knowledge or science: el arte de navegar, or maritime navigation, la traca de naus, or naval construction, and el arte de hacer cartas, or cartography. Pinheiro reveals that only 3% of all European incunables were printed in Spain, and only 7% of all printing in 16th century Europe occurred in Spain. In this manner, unpublished manuscripts like the Libro function as essential transmitters of scientific knowledge. It was notoriously difficult to obtain the special license necessary to even transcribe, let alone print texts pertaining to the arte de navegar or the arte de hacer cartas. In fact, Pinheiro states that the few texts that tended to comply with license standards were those designed for teaching, like the Libro de Cosmographía. This lends automatic significance to the fact that Medina submitted his manuscript to the Council of Indies and obtained the title of cosmographer and a position at the Casa via royal decree, the text of which you can see on the screen right now. The royal decree, or Real Cédula, dated December 20th, 1538, states, por parte de vos, Pedro de Medina, me ha sido relación que vos tenéis noticia de hacer todos los instrumentos necesarios para la navegación de las nuestras Indias. Hicisteis presentación de un nuevo regimiento de la altura del sol y del norte y un libro de cosmografía que había desfecho. If Medina's manuscript is truly as critics have suggested, a mere regurgitation of classical or medieval knowledge, he likely wouldn't have received this license to work at the forefront of government-sponsored secret science. The genre of the navigation manual to which Medina's Libro belongs is a codification of different techniques and principles, making it a practical and theoretical work. And this leads to my third question. The officials of the Casa were tasked with developing navigational charts, instruments, and astronomical tables that would help in the training of pilots. Although the instruction of pilots was officially the purview of the piloto mayor, or head pilot, until 1552, in practice, resident cosmographers like Medina contributed heavily to the content of coursework. As seen in a legal dispute between piloto mayor Sebastian Cabot and Medina in 1544, the conflict between pilotos and cosmographers, exacerbated upon Cabot's resumption of the role of piloto mayor, was due in part to his and other pilotos' biases against the new approach to the arte de navegar, which developed in his absence. One of the hallmarks of this alternate approach was the production of pilots versed in, quote, astronomical navigation, which you can see in my third question, or the use of celestial bodies to determine latitude and longitude, albeit the latter was done incorrectly. So, like most navigation manuals, the Libro claims to be written for the pilots tasked with navigating ships, but this is a baseless assertion, since most cosmographers knew the older generation of pilots to be broadly illiterate. As Portuondo points out, these manuals were written to standardize navigational principles, but not with the expectation that extant pilots like Cabot would actually read them. The hope for Medina and others was that their work would solve the shortage of pilots for transoceanic expeditions by producing new pilots whose training would allow them to reach the New World more reliably. Thus, the Libro is an artifact of this conflict, often embodied in legal disputes between experienced pilots like Cabot and theoreticians like Medina over the course of navigational instruction at the Casa. And this leads me into my actual project, the digital edition. The digitization of early modern archival material from Spain through archives like Pares, managed by the Ministerio de Cultura y Deporte, has been crucial to the production of global scholarship in the fields of cosmographical literature and early modern Spanish historiography. Experts in digital humanities like Burles and Folk contend that digital editions are important to scholarship because they force scholars to confront the, quote, residual complexity or gap that drives a creative process of interpretation and makes their concepts and assumptions explicit. This makes them the perfect medium for studying intertextuality and for answering my theory questions. But before I can get into the crux of my digital edition, it's important to note the decisions I made when transcribing all 66 foliated pages of the Libro. When deciding between a faithful reproduction of the manuscript's idiosyncrasies in a diplomatic transcription or a critical transcription with modernized orthography and syntax, I ultimately chose the latter. This is because the target audience for my transcription are university students, particularly at the undergraduate level, who want exposure to 16th century Habsburg imperial cosmographical literature and science. While the digitized facsimile, footnotes, and hyperlinks that comprise the hypertextual edition are of interest to researchers in all of these fields, particularly history of science and cosmographical history, I acknowledge that such experts are most likely going to produce their own diplomatic transcription of the text based on my facsimiles. The table that you see on your screen is a list of all of my editorial decisions. These are encoded in the TEI header of my hypertextual edition under the element editorial declaration. While I'm not going to get into all of them right now, I do think there's an aspect of digitization that's very interesting when transcribing. And for that, I would like to discuss two different examples that I have in the table. The manuscript use of the word dende and the manuscript use of the word desuso, which in modern Spanish, desuso being translated often instead to arriba or to indicate something above, and dende now being used very infrequently, almost non-existently, preferred instead for its variant form deste. As you can see here in this example from my digital transcription, The beauty of a digital transcription is that it allows someone to create not just the traditional footnotes, but also to hyperlink definitions to words that need to be maintained even in normalized transcriptions because of their added context. With the example here, you can see dende and its archaic form and what it means today. But in the case of desuso, which is used frequently throughout the manuscript, I was actually able to figure out that Medina uses the word not in the sense of arriba, which I could just normalize, but rather as a pointer term to guide the reader back towards earlier sections that connect to the current topic he's discussing. So for example, it's used almost in conjunction with how we would use aforementioned, or as I have stated earlier. The nice thing about a digital edition is that I could use the anchor function to encode this into my edition. So when you approach moments when Medina wishes for you to flip back, you can just click it and flip back much more easily. But now to get to my actual questions briefly. I basically wanted to ascertain the role of the manuscript in the milieu of 16th century Spanish science. With regards to the first two questions that I posed, through a digital edition, I was able to show how Medina used the idea of experiencia, particularly in folio 6R and 64 verso, as a means of working outside the scope or authority of the classics. This method is similar to what Pinheiro describes in his overview of early 16th century Spanish science. Rather than directly contradict Aristotle, Sacrobosco, or Ptolemy, Medina's cosmography, as an applied science, borrows concepts from their works and corrects their applications. Medina's corrections draw from his contemporaries' experiencia, or knowledge of the newly conquered Indies. This is important because it challenges the critical reception of the manuscript by the Journal of European Studies, and even Lamb herself, by illustrating that the manuscript's adherence to classical models is not purely medieval, but rather embedded within the milieu of 16th century cosmography. The manuscript's preface, folio 6R, opens by paraphrasing the penultimate line of Inciso Summa de Geografía, la experiencia de nuestros tiempos que es madre de todas las cosas, folio 58R, as la experiencia como madre de las cosas. I used the elements figure and graphic to embed the digital facsimile of folio 58R of the Summa alongside folio 6R of the Libro, and the element fig desk, or figure description, to describe the context of the former. This idea of experience as the mother of all things, or guide of all conduct, is a Castilianization of an aphorism attributed to Julius Caesar in Book 2, paragraph 8 of De Bello Civile, which, forgive my Latin, states, ut est rerum omnium magister usus. The relevance of this is twofold. First, unlike Inciso, who was part of the 1513 colonization of the Isthmus of the Darien in modern-day Panama, Medina, at this point, without the title of cosmographer, had neither the first-hand knowledge nor the royal authorization to directly discuss the Indies. However, his work suggests a strong awareness of the state of the field through oblique references to how the experience gained from the discovery of the New World has changed the classical understanding of Ptolemy's oikumene, or known world. Nowhere is this clearer than in his response to question 81. In this example that you can see that I've encoded on screen, I use ref target to link readers to folio 24R, a digital edition of Sacro Bosco's De Sfera from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, which makes it clear that Medina's description of both the 7 climas and the existence of a zona torrida, or torrid zone, is almost a direct Castilianization of Sacro Bosco's text, with one crucial modification. Medina prefaces his paraphrasal of Sacro Bosco's text with the claim, Los antiguos dividieron aquella tierra, de que tuvieron noticia ser habitable, en 7 partes o climas, or the ancients divided the world of which they had notice, or which they understood, of which they had evidence, in 7 parts, or climates, and ends it with the statement, Más por experiencia vemos que debajo de la inicial que tuvieron por inhabitable, creyendo hacer allí gran color ahora, tierra habitable y muy templada hallamos. These passages, disregarded in both Pham's facsimile edition of the manuscript and its reviews, are instances of Medina referring directly to the observation of peoples in the equatorial regions of the New World that Ptolemy, Aristotle, and Sacrobosco considered too hot for habitation. The notion of expediency in the manuscript, which acknowledges the first-hand observation of Medina's contemporaries, such as Enciso, seems to be a precursor to the late 16th and early 17th century modern understanding of the term. In Sebastián de Covarrubias's Tesoro de la Lengua Castellana o Española, 1611, experiencia or experiencia is defined as madre de las artes, el conocimiento y noticia de alguna cosa que ha sabido por uso, probándola, experimentándola, sin enseñamiento de otro, de salir cierta en muchos particulares, resulta el arte que es de universales. And a synthesis of the Latin experimentia and the Greek imperia. While Medina's experiencia is certainly not entirely first-hand, as the Tesoro's definition mandates, he justifies his numerous modifications to classical concepts. For example, his model of a 32-wind compass rose that privileges a model of 8 principal winds rather than the 12-wind rose model of his Italian contemporaries like Battista Agnis, derived from St. Isidore of Seville and Aristotle in folio 46R, based on his recent observations or those of fellow cosmographers and/or navigators. As you can see on the screen, this leads me to my final question. Does the manuscript discuss astronomical navigation? And in folios 54R through 54V, Medina's response to a question asked by Piloto illustrates the view of modernizing the arte de navegar that would later put him at odds with Cabot. This answers my third question pertaining to astronomical navigation. This section in the manuscript also showcases Medina's, quote, nuevo regimiento de la altura del sol, mentioned in the royal decree of 1538. Medina's manuscript shows how, as noted by Portuondo, quote, although the theoretical framework remained Ptolemaic and largely Aristotelian, the instruments and data used to practice cosmography were wholly modern, with a strong emphasis on the mathematical aspects of the discipline. In the Libro, one can therefore perceive the same motivation underscoring Medina's famous arte. To quote early modern historian of science, Stefano Julicia, by replacing dead reckoning and navigation by compass with celestial observation and astronomical correction, Medina wanted to finally set the record straight and dispel the ignorant, unreliable training of the pilots in Seville. Ultimately, despite the hints of a modern understanding underscoring his manuscript, Medina's experiencia with the haphazard record-keeping of pilots and their navigational charts, which indicated, as he states in his famous lawsuit against Cabot, como los pilotos no entienden ni tienen más ciencia, informed his stubborn rejection of facts like magnetic declination, despite numerous observed records that contradicted his position. With regards to my edition, future work remains to be done in a few crucial areas, which I intend to add to next year with the help of specialists in the field, as I'm an MPhil student who still has 1 more year at Oxford. Firstly, I'm polishing my Latin so as to decipher the Marginalia, particularly in folio 12R, which I infer is an annotation by a reader educated in cosmography that is quoting some classical work from which Medina has drawn his ideas. Secondly, while I have some hypotheses about the provenance of this manuscript, which is one of a few Spanish manuscripts and even fewer scientific manuscripts among the theological corpus acquired by the Bodleian from the collection of Venetian Jesuit canonici, I would like to substantiate this hypothesis with more access to archival material now that the Bodleian libraries will hopefully remain fully open this year. I would then like to incorporate this information into the TEI header of my digital edition. Finally, I would like to verify the number of different hands in the text through paleographical analysis to encode into the TEI header under hand description. In conclusion, this digital edition of MS Canon Ital 243 lays the groundwork for further research into the development of the notion of experience in early to mid-16th century Iberian works, and is the basis for my current research supervised by Dr. Alice Brooke. In dialogue with Ramachandran's concept of world-making, I argue that while scholars have identified the development of experiencia in Spanish science during the latter part of the 16th century as part of a broader humanistic wave across Europe. We can trace the appearance and multiple usages of this word in manuscripts dated earlier than the Relaciones Geográficas of 1579 to 1585, conventionally used to mark the advent of a more empirical science. By expanding our guide to the navigator's universe, my digital edition aims to provide the reader with multiple avenues towards heterogeneous perspectives of scientific modernity. Thank you. And I'd like to do a special thanks to Henrike, to Emma Huber, and to Andrew Dunning for working with me throughout this project. Emma, in particular, saved me heavily with certain problems in coding, and I couldn't have done this edition without her.
And thanks to you for reminding us of the importance of experiencia, which could be a kind of motto for the whole history of the book course. And I think we have all learned heavily through hands-on dealing with the materiality of the manuscript, but also with the on-screen reality of the manuscript. So I think over to Andrew to show the manuscript, and I was particularly struck that some of the elements are not that dissimilar between the two manuscripts. So the chart that Carrie was showing at the beginning, the kind of cosmological worldview, quite well goes well with the cosmographia that you've been showing.
Yes, actually, when I saw that, I was struck by the giant torrid zone and different 7 climates in the middle, the different directions. It's very similar. So in terms of what's interesting, I was wondering if you go to the very end of the manuscript, to folio 66R, that has the blank diagram. So it would be before that. Yes, right there. So this diagram is really interesting because it in part informed a thought process that I had about whether or not this manuscript was initially intended for print at some point. Throughout the manuscript, there are multiple hands, and you can see instructions and corrections that are made in a hand that's different from the primary hand of the manuscript. And in this section, which accompanies the final question, question 82 of the manuscript, that is actually about a certain navigational technique, the accompanying text itself describes this diagram as a kind of Portolan chart. However, as you can see on your screen, for anyone who has knowledge of Portolan charts, this only shows the 32 compass wind rows, or the rum lines at the center, that then intersect out, but it is missing the concomitant coast, which usually is necessary to indicate a Portolan chart. That is the function of those navigational charts. And what's also interesting is that you can see in faint scrawl the word Mar Negro, which might indicate that this was meant to initially show you at that point the Black Sea, with everything else, the coastline, transcribed around it, which would match the text itself. However, for some reason it was never completed. It's unclear whether something was meant to be pasted on top of it, underneath it, whether it was a mistake, but it's very fascinating. Also, if you go to folio, I believe it's 12R or 12V.
Perhaps before we turn further, Andrew, do you want to show the completed Portolan chart?
Yeah, so if you'd like to just see one example of what one of these books would look like, there's a great example on the Bodleian website.
I can actually share it if that's all right. I could, if you want to,
perfect, yeah.
Screen sharing.
Yeah. Actually, yes. I think
it's 2R and 3B.
Yeah, so this is MS DOS 390, which is this is the fanciest of our Portolan maps, of which we have several. And so here we have here's an example of you can see it's very similar coloring to what we have in the Canonici manuscript, but all the coasts are very nicely filled in. this is a particularly interesting manuscript. We're actually in the process right now of, the studio's in the process right now of making a facsimile of this map. You can see this is the cover of it. This is really ornate wooden binding with these really nice miniatures on the inner boards. And so it's this real luxury object. So this is over whether this is actually meant to be a functional object. There's also a really great box that goes with it, which, here we go. If you look it up on our website, you can see a 3D representation of it. And so you can see, so the lid, that bit on the top there will actually come off, and then that's how you access the book inside. So that's what a very fancy porcelain map actually looks like.
There's a question of what the box is made of.
The box is made of wood on the inside. I'm not quite sure what kind of, I think it's beech, if I remember correctly. And then it is covered
Probably covered with leather, isn't it?
Yes, exactly, yes.
So it's fairly similar process to bookbinding, where you would press into the wet leather these stamps.
Yes, and I'll just pull up an image of, here's the two objects together, and so you can see that they go together quite nicely, actually. And the box is precisely made to match the size of this book. Should we go back to?
Yeah, let's go back to the manuscript.
So you want to go to 12 recto, right?
Yeah, it's either 12 recto or 12 verso. It's one of those. I'm not quite remembering.
Here we go.
Perhaps it's a different page. 1 second.
Oh, I'm so. Hold on. Might be using the original affiliation.
Yes, right there. That's the page. So in that page, you can actually see the marginalia that I was discussing, that I'm interested in trying to decipher. I believe that it is quoting some classical text, and I've looked up different options. At first, it was recommending that perhaps it was Cicero, but after using context clues, that didn't really make sense. Like, it uses a lot of the language that Latin edition of Cicero are using, like even the word choice, but contextually it didn't really make sense to what was being discussed, which is a very scientific treatise that it seems that it is some version of Ptolemy that's actually being cited, but I don't know which edition. I don't know who wrote it. But I would love to do more investigation into that marginalia and eventually encode it into my digital edition as well, once I'm more certain where it comes from.
Are there any other key aspects of this manuscript that you want to take a look at what we have here?
I mean, I guess if we could just flip through some of the diagrams, just because I think they are pretty.
Oh, they're absolutely fantastic.
Interestingly illustrated.
Yes, that wonderful title page. There's the first one.
Yeah, so here you can see a pretty classical version of the Ptolemaic model. It's discussing the different celestial spheres, ending with the Impereo, has the primum mobile in it. I mean, Medina focuses mostly on the primum mobile, and a lot of his diagrams, and especially his discussion of the elements, is very directly derived from Aristotle's De Coelo, and then different modifications and interpretations of that. But it's interesting to see some of the diagrams.
Yes, and there's another one that you showed us earlier.
Yes, this relates to when Medina is actually discussing the different coordinates of the different parts of the world, and he's actually describing like his definition of like latitudes, and the section accompanying it is also a discussion of different navigational techniques that Medina is talking about, which also leads into my broader notion of questions of astronomical navigation, the fact that you're actually using celestial coordinates and celestial bodies to navigate.
Oh yes, and we also had, there's also the fun problem in this manuscript that we tried to figure out earlier in the term of this page is a nice example of showing how it's been corrected, and you can see these little bits that of a paper that have been pasted over very tidily over other sections to try to imitate the original as well as possible, but still managing to make a bit of a mess of it.
Yeah, if you were to look at some of these paste-ins and then compare, so when I was initially looking at whether or not it was possible that Medina himself wrote this manuscript, and I was comparing it to like evidence in Bares or in the archives that exist of Medina's hand, particularly in lawsuits and letters that he wrote in between them. What was interesting is not only does the hand not match, but it's possible that you would use a different, more formal hand for something that was being submitted to the king, so that doesn't necessarily rule it out completely. But the fact that there are such basic mistakes of directions, especially cardinal directions, even in some of the diagrams that had to be pasted over, makes me think that Medina was looking over someone else's work and then correcting it later and telling someone to correct it, because the mistakes are not of like complex things. They're very basics, like not knowing which winds were in the north and which are in the south, things that I would imagine are more intuitive to Medina.
Many thanks. I'll stop the recording